Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Bedtime Stories with Neelu. How are you? Thank you so much for all your story responses on yesterday's story, the story of Hua Mulan. So, the we discussed about this Hua Mulan, who was a Chinese warrior and a woman who really was very brave. Those who missed this story can go back to my IGTV on Instagram and catch it anytime. Coming to today's story. Today's story is the title is The Prince and the Pauper. I found it on a children's website. My thoughts on the story. So once there lived a king, a rich king, and his wife gave birth to a boy, and he was a very beautiful prince and named Edward. They named him Edward. At the same time, in the kingdom, there was another poor couple who gave birth to a boy, and that boy was named Tom. And Tom and Edward were born at the same time. So King Prince Edward was completely pampered, and he was amongst riches, and he was like, he lived a very very princely life because he was a prince, and all the time he had the richest food to eat. He had huge palace gardens and to move around, and he had swords to learn swordsmanship, and he was trained very well, and he was that kind of a his upbringing was such. Yeah, and then on one side, this poor boy was beaten up by his father. Tom was beaten up by his father, and he led a very, very hard life. There was no food to eat. So one day, Tom was like, wandering around the palace gates, and he tried to enter. Then immediately the guards shooed him away. And Prince Edward, who was coming that way after a stroll, just picked up Tom and he said, "You come along with me." And he took him inside the palace. And they both sat down and played for a very long time. And then Prince Edward said, "Let's swap our dresses and let's, I will become Tom and you become Edward." So, to this, very hesitatingly, Tom agreed because he was very worried that people in the palace would recognize him. But the moment he wore Edward's clothes, he almost looked like Edward because they both were born at the same time. They almost looked the same. Yeah. So they both exchanged clothes, and the prince went out of the palace, and the poor boy sat and enjoyed the luxuries of the palace. Yeah, enjoyed royalty. So the poor boy kept, the prince kept moving around as a poor boy all through the streets, and people really hated him. They didn't speak to him properly. And when he went back home, the father bet him very hard and, asked him to beg a meal and get it. And he would go from door to door, but he wouldn't receive, a single person wouldn't give him any meal. So, like this, the prince spent a lot of time as a poor boy, and he really got very tired. And by that time, Tom was enjoying all the luxuries of the palace. He went around and he tried to tell people that he was not actually Edward, but no one believed him because he was wearing princely clothes at that time when they found him. So he kept enjoying his life, and then one day there was a coronation ceremony announced. Yeah, they would crown him as the prince. And at that time, this announcement reached the prince who was in the poor boy's clothes, yeah, Edward. So Edward wanted to get back to the kingdom, but the guards wouldn't let him come in. So finally, he kept wandering on the streets hopelessly, and then wanting to find a way back to the palace. But then at that time, he found a man who was a very good swordsman, yeah, with whom Tom won a particular battle at some point in time. Not battle exactly, they learned swordsmanship together. So Tom went there and explained, Tom, the one prince who is Prince Edward, who is in the form of a poor boy like Tom, he went back and he told him that this is, made him understand that he was the prince, and he reminded him of all the good times they had together. Then immediately that soldier, that warrior, he immediately said, "Okay, I'll take you back to the palace." Yeah, and with his help, he reaches the palace. And when Edward reaches the palace, he sees as Tom, he sees the actual, Tom as Edward, and then he goes and barges into his room, and says, "I'm back." So yeah, Tom for a second, thinks that he shouldn't be giving up all this, and he wouldn't want to go back to that poor life, where there's nothing to eat. But then his heart tells him that he should be honest, and being an honest boy, though he was very very poor, he was very honest. So he immediately got up and he said, "Please take your seat." And that's how Edward's coronation ceremony starts, and he becomes a king, or he is crowned as a prince that day. And then he makes the boy, for he appreciates Tom for his honesty and makes him his knight. Yeah, and they both together rule the kingdom very nicely. ever after. Yeah, for a very long time. So there ends the story, Prince and the Pauper. So for me, like while reading this story, though it was a very, very short kid story, but I was just thinking, what a nice, what an honest man Tom was. Yeah, what an honest boy Tom was. He could have easily stayed back because no one objected him as a prince, but he chose to be honest. So honesty is the best policy. That is the message in the story. So while reading this story, I was thinking, as a child, I lived for some time in a village. My father was a banker and he was posted in a village, and there, like, we lived for some time, like our bank building was getting constructed, so they put us in another house. So that house was a proper, like, proper independent house. But the man who constructed that house was a farmer. Yeah, and he would stay in a small hut close by, a clean hut, but it was a hut. And he had rented out that house to us. So we were very happy, but I would always be so curious to go and sit in that hut and eat with them. So, and my mother would say, "That's not the place to go, you shouldn't be going there." But I would sneak in, go to their place, and my sister also used to tag along, and we used to go there and sit and enjoy all the meals they cooked. We would eat along with them, and there was a barn, behind, and there was a field also, there were crops also there, and we would go and see how this, spinach and all is grown, and there was this haystack, and we would, by evening they would have this cow dung and all, cows tied on one side, and they would make a clean floor with the cow dung, and dried cow dung, and there we used to play. And it was a very, now when I think about it, the evenings were beautiful. Every evening I would land up there, and after that they would call me for a meal, and I would quietly eat something and go back home and not tell my mother. And my mother would ask me, "You went there and you ate something?" I would say, "No, no, no, I didn't eat anything. I would eat little at home." But I would enjoy those meals which, the farmers cooked, because their meals were very different. They would cook it on a, on coal. Yeah, and it had a different flavor. Yeah. So while reading this Prince and Pauper, I remembered that, yeah, we all eat only a stomach full, but how many times do we think that all of us, can share a meal together and eat together, and it's the same. Yeah, it only fills your stomach. So I remembered a little instance from my childhood, and this is a very cute one, where we used to sneak in and play there with their kids, and we used to eat. I used to eat, and I was, of course, the leader, and my sister followed me. But yeah, I would enjoy that time with them. Yeah, with the farmers. So, what you remembered when you heard this story, please put it down in your comments. I would respond to all those comments related to the story. So, I'll see you here again tomorrow only on Bedtime Stories with Neelu. Till then, take care, sleep well, wake up with a purpose and a good thought. Good night.